Walking the earth is an ancient practice, and even more ancient is walking with nothing between the soles of our feet and the earth. Still, there is so much we do not know about the soils beneath our feet. What we do know is that the soil is a wilderness all its own, comprised of complex biota. The soil is not dead, and we need to stop treating it like dirt.
And we just almost never have our bare feet in the dirt or our bare feet on the natural ground. And again, I think, the symbolism of it and the way that we've become so separated from the natural ground is pretty powerful.
It is a wilderness upon which all of our lives depends, from the food that we eat to the water that we drink. And amidst this great biodiversity loss, we are too unawareingly killing an unfathomable amount more than perhaps we can even comprehend. Those millions of species that make up the soil and that life which gives us life. In this episode, we will be speaking with returning guest Paul Bogard about his book, The Ground Beneath Us. Join us as we discuss perhaps the most threatened of all wildernesses, a wilderness hidden beneath our feet. The book really starts out by painting somewhat of a stark picture that in reality there is a much greater loss of life than we could even conceive of in this grand scheme of biodiversity loss, accounting for the living soil. Could you start off by talking to the extent humans have influenced the Earth's surface, what that means for us and the rest of life?
Sure. I think that, humans have influenced the Earth's surface tremendously. It depends, on kind of what degree of what do you mean by influence. I think there's at one end of the scale, there are, for example, our oldest cities, that have been around for a long time and that have been in place and their history goes down, 20 or 30 meters, that kind of thing. And there are newer cities as well. And one thing that big cities, no matter where they are, tend to have in common is that they are built on oftentimes really fertile ground, ground that was good for growing food. That's where people settled. And they also tend to be by waterways and oftentimes by the ocean. And so we have a situation now in modern life where you have a lot of, at a time when we have more and more people and we need to grow more food, we have a lot of really fertile ground that's covered in concrete and pavement. And we also have the problem of rising sea levels, which is going to cause kind of come back to haunt us for covering up ground that's right by the ocean. And then I would say two other ways we've really influenced the ground. One is through agriculture, where we've turned just vast swaths of once wild ground into cultivated ground, into domesticated ground. Oftentimes, especially like in the U.S., it's ground where nothing grows except for one crop, the monoculture kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's powered by chemicals. And the other way we've, influenced basically all the ground on the planet is through climate change, through shifting what climate the ground experiences, and also through, again, our chemicals, where we have chemical pollutants in the atmosphere that fall on the remotest ground and and contaminate it that way. So to greater or lesser degrees, depending on how you look at it, I think humans have really essentially dominated the ground that is the planet.
You talk about these lifeless sort of crops that are kind of taking over the world. These modern crops are asphalt and concrete. And of course, we can't eat asphalt. And even though asphalt and concrete are nothing new, they remain ever prevalent and in some ways a very serious threat. It really begs the question, where then will life end? At that very last patch of native ground before being paved over and sealed lifeless. So this might be obvious, but you mentioned this term, soil sealing. First of all, what is soil sealing, and why is it so important to consider and bring awareness to?
Yeah, soil sealing. I mean, it's just sort of this terrible term once you think about it, because the soil is alive, essentially. There's so much life in the soil, and we're finding out more and more how alive the ground or the soil is, and how important that life is to other forms of life. And what happens when you pave over ground, when you pave over soil, you essentially kill it. It has no way to get the water it needs, and all the other life-giving processes that it needs to stay alive. So soil sealing is essentially just like it sounds. It's like sealing off this living ground, and essentially killing it.
It's just being suffocated.
Yeah, absolutely.
And of course, you mentioned the amount of microbial life that thrives in healthy soil. Something like millions of species to just a tablespoon of healthy soil, which is truly mind blowing. And it reminded me of something the Dalai Lama once said that I heard years ago when he was speaking to a group of people at a park. And he said, we don't know all there is to know about life. So be gentle to the world around you, including even the grass that you're sitting upon and walking upon. That was very humbling to hear. And it's humbling to know that we just don't have our heads wrapped around how much life there actually is on Earth. I live in the desert Southwest, and the way that people often regard the desert is very bizarre. For instance, when selling land in the desert, contractors will often go in and clear cut the natural vegetation and then dump gravel throughout the lot, which never made any sense to me. It's like they're literally erasing the earth. And what's even more strange is that that's what people find ideal instead of just building within the natural landscape. So this is a kind of soil sealing that's happening in the desert. And these gravel lots in and of themselves create problems such as noxious weeds and sometimes erosion and stuff like that. People don't really relate soil to the desert, thinking that it's somewhat devoid of life, and they kind of treat it like it's a barren place. And what many people don't really understand is that intact deserts have incredibly complex biocrusts that not only provide the soil with nutrients, but has a relatively strong matrix that resists erosion and desertification. As soon as these biocrusts become impacted or broken, they lose integrity, and then desertification can happen more quickly. And so this issue of soil preservation is not limited to particular bioregions with rich and loamy soils. It's completely worldwide, and I think that's important.
Yeah, and that's, another thing that I think people don't understand is that the uh, depth and value of soil really varies a lot from place to place. And so you have a lot of places where there's I go to a place, for example, in England, where there's, as it was described to me, 6 inches of soil and then chalk. It's 6 inches between life and death. And then, of course, there's places in the tropics, in Africa, South America, lots of places, the deserts, where you have an inch or less of soil. And so any kind of mistreatment of that precious resource is really devastating, not only to the ground but eventually to the life depending on that ground.
So, to really get this message across of soil preservation on a wider scale, it seems reasonable to reach out to those who are seemingly really connected to the earth, such as farmers, who affect a lot of the land's surface through agriculture. Yet this doesn't seem to really result in very much traction of changing the way things are done in terms of soil degradation. Because as long as, let's say, farmers are getting the yields that they're getting and that they are satisfied with, they're not going to be willing to change what they are doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. It's, I think it's hard to, generalize about farmers. I think a lot of them, though, get sort of trapped into this chemical reliant farming. And I think if they would probably say that they really care about the land, and I don't know that they're lying, but just the system of farming that they're part of is really devastating.
So I work sometimes in watershed restoration and really see this work as rewilding efforts because essentially we are focused on reestablishing native ground. The ideas we have in the field extend to the ideas we feel, or at least I feel, every yard in America should ideally be, which is as native as possible. You make a very good point in the book saying that nobody even really wants all the costs that come with maintaining these green lawns, whether it's from fertilizers, pesticides, or mowing, etc. So let's talk about the seemingly endless discussion about the problem with the green lawn mentality.
Yeah, I mean, it is a problem. It's our greatest crop. It's what we grow the most of in this country, which is kind of amazing. And it's in all too many places. It's just almost a sterile ecosystem. And so the thing that and that's because we use to keep it to try to meet this ideal image of what a lawn should look like, which is essentially just green with no blemishes or nothing else growing there. We use a ton of chemicals, which then kill everything else in the ground and have a impact on pollinating insects and birds and all sorts of creatures.
So truly, lawns are just missed opportunities of potential native spaces that wildlife can utilize.
Well, I think that's the thing that stands out to me the most is that I grew up in a suburb and I can appreciate a lawn, but we just have way more of it than we need. There's just so many places where you could have a little bit of lawn in the front yard of a house or something, and then turn the rest of the yard into native species, native flowers and grasses and that kind of thing. We just don't need these huge campuses of Kentucky bluegrass.
Yeah.
It's such a waste of habitat.
And again, all the money and energy and time it takes to actually maintain these unnaturally green spaces, which nobody even wants.
No, I mean, people complain all the time about, having to, mow the lawn and fertilize the lawn and spend money on the lawn and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, you don't have to do that. Like, there are other things that you could do.
The ground beneath us really talks about this disconnect that we have with the earth beneath our feet. And a little over 7 months ago, I started a daily barefoot walking practice myself. And it started out with just some walking around where I live, around my house, in the native lots around my house and in my garden. But as my feet got stronger, it turned into longer hikes, and I eventually went on day hikes 2 or 3 times a week. And it's been an interesting journey because I've toughened up my feet like crazy. It's amazing what we can do. And I've actually learned quite a bit about some different aspects of the earth just in this short time. But it's really interesting the amount of aversion towards barefoot walking that I've gotten from people who have either seen me on the trail barefoot or have learned that I do this. It's just an overwhelming sense of anxiety, like, oh, be careful, but I really feel like we're meant to be able to do this. I mean, it's one of the most natural things I can think of, and it's just been an interesting journey in that respect as well. But going back to the book, you briefly, very briefly, talked about this concept called grounding and its benefits, and you talk a little bit about the evidence behind it. Could you share with us a bit about what your thoughts are on this concept of grounding?
It's funny. I had a number of people talk to me about that when I was researching the book, but it never became something that I really followed up on. So I don't. But I think that for me, and there are a number of points in the book where I purposefully take off my shoes to walk on the ground barefoot, and it's so symbolic of our relationship to the planet and the fact that we, as I say, we spend 95% of our time inside, and then when we do walk outside, we walk on pavement, and we just almost never have our bare feet in the dirt or our bare feet on the natural ground. And again, I think some people swear by the idea of grounding and that kind of thing, but even if you don't, I just think the symbolism of it and the way that we've become so separated from the natural ground is pretty powerful.
In the book, you said something that was really incredible, and that was that indigenous peoples look in the four directions to give thanks, while on the other hand, surveyors look in all directions with an entirely different agenda to divide and sell the land. And it reminded me of this lot down the road from where I live. I live on the outskirts of a very small town, so it's very natural for the most part. And yet, this inconspicuous lot, maybe about 4 acres large, was suddenly clear cut, and it just was this great big flat dirt lot. And then I saw a for sale sign. It's just one of those things that really irks me. It's like, well, you can build in and around the natural landscape, so this is what people are looking for. And again, it's that whole mentality that we have of what's ideal.
I think so. And I mean, we're so disconnected from nature, and we don't see ourselves as, animals living in habitat. We, see ourselves as separated from nature kind of thing. I think, if on the optimistic point of view, for a lot of people, it is becoming and has become a real value to live in cities that have, like I live in Minneapolis most of the time, and the park system here is pretty amazing, and people really value that. And so there are a lot of people who do value that. It's just that, it's sort of like the political divide in the country. It's like there are also an equal number of people who seem oblivious to it, which is remarkable to me. I don't get it.
It is, and I try to remind myself not to discount the efforts that are being done. There are a lot of people involved in permaculture and no-till gardening and native planting. We just seem to need it on a greater scale.
There are, it's like so many things that we're just, we're up against this system of industrial agriculture and this sort of systematic education system where people are not taught that we're part of nature. We're taught that we're separate, and it can be kind of overwhelming sometimes to think about, especially if you are somebody who is sensitive to the ground being alive, for example. It can be, as Aldo Leopold says, you live alone in a world of wounds, and it just feels like you're the only one who sees what you see, and it can seem like an enormous task to ever change that.
So, in closing, how has writing and researching this book changed the way you feel about the ground beneath us?
A big sort of basic realization for me with writing the book was that point of the idea of the ground being alive, and that it's, for me, I tried to make the point that it's alive sort of literally, like biologically, it's full of life, but it's also alive, I guess you would say spiritually as well. It's, full of places are full of memory, and even places can be really powerfully spiritual as well. And I think that we're meant to be, in my mind, connected to. We are a part. I guess I would just say we are part of nature. It's a fact, and that when we consider ourselves or think of ourselves as separate from nature, or in this case, the ground, it's ultimately really costly to us, but also costly to, so many other forms of life.
Yeah, I really feel it's important to portray to people what conservation really truly means. And it's not just this conserving nature outside of ourselves and around us, but really conserving our relationship with nature as well.
Yeah, for sure.
So, since I've interviewed you once before, I don't want to ask you the same standard question, but have you had any newer experiences connecting with nature that you might like to share with us?
Yeah, I mean, I think if it's not too domestic, we I just bought a house in Minneapolis, and I'm really enjoying planting stuff all over the yard, and seeing. I planted milkweed, and now we have monarch butterflies, and I've had a couple wonderful days this summer, where I'm I'm just dirty and sweaty, and it feels really good. And I think especially given what I was just talking about in terms of feeling alone in a world of wounds, or feeling like we're up against some these systems that are so huge, it can be really cathartic and wonderful to just play in the dirt. And so that's kind of been my experience of nature this summer that I've really enjoyed.
And for my listeners who might be curious, that was your daughter in the background, and I'm sure you've had some great experiences playing in the dirt with her as well.
She loves it. She took a big handful of it last night, so she got to discover what it tastes like.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
Well, I really want to thank you for writing this book, and sincerely want to say that as this book was winding down, I found myself grasping a little bit and not wanting to leave that sacredness of the soils, those words towards the end. And in a way, it was really capturing the richness of our soils. And
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want it to end because it meant coming back into the reality that we're all facing right now, scrambling to save as much life on this earth as we can. And it just was a really incredible perspective. And now I'm going to find myself thinking about those last couple of chapters while I'm walking barefoot. So thank you very much for offering this book and bringing our life-giving soil into light in this way.
I appreciate your words. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. Reading this book, The Ground Beneath Us, has taught me a lot about the soils. And even the practice I have been taking on, barefoot walking, in the past year, has taught me a lot. I have learned to observe and respect the limitations of my feet, and to how strong they can actually be. I have learned more about what earth truly is, and the differences between ground and native ground. I have learned how comfortable it is to walk on the earth, and how uncomfortable and displeasing it is to walk on the ever-pervasive concrete and asphalt, which I avoid. I have even learned about a particular native grass which I have never before identified growing around my house. I learned of this grass's life cycle when I quite literally stepped into it during seeding season this past June. The seeds were prolific and quite conspicuous to the soles of my feet. It is now a beautiful native grass that I have come to appreciate. Barefoot walking is a practice that I have adopted indefinitely. The experience of keeping the soles of my feet more and more grounded to the earth has nurtured a new kind of resiliency, a natural ability we have abandoned. Now I long for more of that time in which my feet are in contact with native ground, and even dread wearing shoes for longer than is necessary. Barefoot walking has been nourishment for both my soul and souls. Now more than ever, I am enjoying the time I spend literally walking on this earth, forever reminded of its life-giving soils.